Poverty, one of the most persistent and ever-increasing problems that has plagued our nation for many years. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, approximately 46.2 million Americans fall under the classification of being poor. That's 15.1% of the total population, the largest number in the 52 years since poverty estimates in the U.S. have been published. Here in the South, we are no strangers to poverty. Even if we don't live in poverty, most of us have seen it firsthand on our way to work or school. Those who do live in poverty in the southern United States comprise the region with the highest poverty rate at 16.9%, translating to about 19.1 million people. The most notable region in this study is the Black Belt, a term originally coined by Booker T. Washington in 1901 that referred to the color of the rich southern soil that slaves had worked on in the region. Today, used more as a political term, the Black Belt comprises 11 southern states with an above-average percentage of black residents: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. All across the nation, but most certainly in the South, poverty is usually something we tend to associate with African Americans. This is by no means a completely false perception. African Americans today have the single highest poverty rate of all races at 27.4%, but poverty has not always been associated as being a black problem. Certain events, many that took place in the American South, created a negative perception of blacks as being mostly poor. These negative perceptions still exist today and in some cases even affect political attitudes toward poverty and welfare. Although African Americans have been disproportionately poor for quite some time, the white population largely ignored black poverty until the mid-1960s. Until then, poverty was perceived as a white problem, most commonly associated with the poor rural whites of the Appalachian coal fields. The shift in focus from rural whites to African Americans can be attributed to several factors. Black outmigration, that is, the migration of black Southerners to northern cities in the first half of the 20th century, an increase in the representation of blacks among AFDC beneficiaries during the same time period, and of course, the civil rights movement in the early 1960s paved the way for the transition that was to come. These events, most specifically the civil rights movement, did not directly cause the racialization of poverty as a black problem, so much as they created the environment for it. The struggle for racial equality and an end to legal segregation in the southern United States cast the national spotlight on what was, by the rest of the nation, a largely ignored African American problem. After the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, black civil rights leaders shifted the focus from legal to economic equality for blacks. As the nation became more aware of the problems African Americans faced, so did the media. The mid to late 1960s saw a significant change in the media's attitude towards poverty. This less sympathetic overtone correlated with a surge of images of poor African Americans to accompany their coverage of poverty. One particular study indicates that the number of blacks pictured in articles on poverty in news magazines such as Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report saw an increase from 27% in 1964 to 72% in 1967. Since then, African Americans have continued to dominate and be overrepresented by the media's coverage of poverty, constituting 57% of the images seen in these same publications from 1967 to 1992. The media's racialization of poverty has had a great effect on the public perception of mainly blacks as being poor. Here in the South, it has only reinforced the age-old stereotype of blacks as being lazy and undeserving. Today, as well as in recent years, the most negative perceptions of poor African Americans concerns their involvement in welfare. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, passed in 1996, ended welfare as an entitlement program. Since its passing, welfare reform has been successful in eliminating many welfare caseloads, but hasn't been nearly as effective in lifting welfare recipients out of poverty. Welfare reform in the South, however, seems to be in some cases influenced by the negative perceptions of the poor and overwhelmingly black population that comprise the region, one recent example being the passing of mandatory drug testing for welfare recipients in Florida by Governor Rick Scott, which is also being considered in southern states such as Alabama, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi. A more notable example, however, is South Carolina Lieutenant Governor and gubernatorial candidate Andre Bauer. Bauer, in a recent speech, compared poor people to stray animals, and that if you stop feeding them, they stop breeding.
Things like that. We can't afford to keep just giving money away. My grandmother was not a highly educated woman, but she told me as a small child to quit feeding stray animals. You know why? Because they breed. You're facilitating the problem. If you give an animal or a person ample food supply, they will reproduce, especially one that don't think too much further than that. And so what you've got to do is you've got to curtail that type of behavior. They don't know any better. I was talking to
This essentially proposes that cutting off government subsidies will result in a decrease in poverty. This is not just an idea specific to South Carolina. Many conservative southern states such as Mississippi and Alabama offer even less support to their poor than South Carolina does. In essence, Southern states seem to want to penalize welfare recipients rather than reward them. To conclude, the negative perceptions of poverty as a black problem still linger today, especially in the South. Bauer later commented that political correctness makes it difficult to discuss such issues. That begs the question of whether future Southern white politicians will voice their apathetic yet honest opinions toward poverty in the South or remain within the confines of being politically correct.